Welcome to Rings of Power, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. In the deepest archives of Middle-earth, where dust settles upon forgotten scrolls and shadows dance between candlelit shelves, there exists a tale that scholars dare only whisper. It is the story of pride ascending to heaven's gate, of mortal hands reaching for immortal crowns, and of the sea's terrible justice when paradise falls to ruin. Once, before pride took root in the hearts of men, Numenor shone like a star upon the western sea. Her white towers pierced the morning mist. Her green fields rolled like emerald waves toward harbors, where ships rested like sleeping swans. The very air seemed blessed, thick with the scent of mullein blossoms and the salt, sweet promise of endless tomorrows. But paradise, as the wise have always known, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. For in that blessed realm, where death came gently and years stretched like golden threads, there stirred a restlessness that would shake the foundations of the world itself. The morning light that once blessed Numenor's shores now seems distant, filtered through the mists of time and tragedy. Yet in those ancient halls, where kings once walked in wisdom, and the faithful kept their vigil toward the west, there echoes still a question that haunts the children of men. How does a kingdom, blessed by the gods themselves, fall into shadow? How does paradise become prison, and gift become curse? The answer lies not in the stars, nor in the malice of dark lords, but in the depths of the human heart, where fear of ending wars with love of beginning, where the gift of mortality transforms into the curse of time, and where the greatest tragedy of all unfolds, the moment when gratitude dies and entitlement is born. Even the brightest morning hides the shadow of dusk, and Numenor's dusk had already begun. In the years when the world was younger and the music of creation still rang clear in mortal ears, there stood upon the western waters an island that seemed carved from the dreams of the Valar themselves. Numenor, the westerness, rose from the sea like a five-pointed star, her coasts embracing harbors deep enough for the greatest ships, her mountains reaching toward clouds that carried the breath of paradise. This was no accident of stone and tide, but a gift beyond the comprehension of lesser kingdoms. When the great shadow of Morgoth fell at last, when his iron crown lay shattered, and his servants fled to the uttermost corners of the earth, the One above all looked upon those who had stood faithful in the darkness. The Edain, the elf friends, had given their blood and breath in service to the light, and such loyalty could not go unrewarded. From Urro's Tar, Miniatur, the half-elven who chose the fate of men over the timeless halls of his kindred, there flowed a line of kings whose very names rang like silver bells in the chronicle of days. The blood of Elthian the Beautiful ran in their veins, mingled with the courage of Bay or the Old and the wisdom of Hader the Golden-Haired. They were more than mortal, yet chose mortality, and in that choice lay both their greatest glory and their ultimate doom. 300 years and more were granted to the early kings of Numenor, while common men might live for 2 centuries, or even 3. Their voices carried the music of the Aena. Their eyes held depths that spoke of starlight on the great waters. and their hands were skilled in every craft, from the forging of swords to the growing of gardens that bloomed eternal spring. The island itself was their inheritance and their reflection. In Armanelos the Golden, the king's city, towers of white stone rose in perfect harmony, their surfaces catching and reflecting the sun until the very air seemed to sing with light. Gardens cascaded down terraced slopes where every flower was a jewel, every tree a masterwork of living art. The harbors of Arcamena welcomed ships whose sails were woven from starlight, whose holds carried not mere cargo, but wonders. Mithril from the misty mountains, silks that shimmered like water, wines that held the essence of distant summers. But it was not wealth that made Numenor great, it was wisdom. In those early days, the sea, kings ruled with justice that flowed like clear water from mountain springs. Laws were few because hearts were pure, and disputes were settled not by the weight of gold, but by the measure of truth. The faithful tended the flame that never died upon Meneltama, the holy mountain, and their prayers rose like incense to the west, where the Valar kept their eternal watch. Yet even in those golden centuries, the wise among them sensed a boundary drawn by hands divine. Ships could sail to every horizon save one. The west was forbidden, veiled behind mists that no mortal craft could pierce. There, beyond the bent world's edge, lay Valinor the Blessed, where the Elder dwelt in light that knew no ending, where time moved differently and death was but a distant rumor. The straight road is not for the feet of men, the Valar had declared, and to this prohibition the early kings bowed with grace. They understood that boundaries were not chains, but safeguards, not limitations, but definitions of their proper place in the great design. The West was home to the deathless. The East awaited those who would, in time, surrender their breath to the giver of all breath. But understanding and accepting are different virtues, and the hearts of men are deep waters where strange currents flow. In the libraries of Armanelos, scholars began to ask questions that had no comfortable answers. If the elves could choose their fate, why not men? If Valinor offered escape from time's erosion, why should it remain forever, closed to those who had served the light with equal courage? The seeds of doubt, once planted, grow in secret places. They send down roots that crack foundations, reach up tendrils that strangle certainties. In the royal gardens where Malon trees whispered with voices learned in Lothlorien, courtiers began to speak in careful phrases about the gift of men, that mortality which the Valar had named blessing, but which felt, increasingly, like a curse wrapped in fair words. For how long can paradise endure when its borders are drawn by divine decree? Time, which flows like honey for the immortal and races like wildfire for men, began to work its subtle alchemy upon the kingdom of the Sea Kings. Generations rose and fell like waves upon the shore, each leaving their mark upon the white stones of Numenor, each adding their voice to the growing chorus of discontent that echoed through the marble halls. The division began quietly, as such things always do, not with proclamations or banners unfurled in defiance, but with glances exchanged across council chambers, with conversations that died when certain ears drew near, with prayers offered to different stars. The heart of Numenor began to beat with two rhythms, and the kingdom itself seemed to hold its breath, sensing that its people stood at a crossroads where only one path could be chosen. The faithful remained true to the ancient ways, their faces turned ever westward as their ancestors had taught them. In the hidden valleys of the Ferostar, they built their quiet settlements, tending gardens where the white tree of Nent, Menna bloomed in defiance of the growing shadow. Their ships still sailed to Middle, earth-bearing gifts rather than conquest. Their captains still spoke the old courtesies to elf, lords in the grey heavens, and their children still learned the high elvish tongue as a thing of beauty rather than a relic to be scorned. Elendil the Tall stood chief among them in those latter days, his height exceeding even that of the ancient kings, his eyes holding the clear light of one who has looked upon Rendil's star and found hope therein. Around him gathered the remnant of the true nobility, not nobility of blood alone, but of spirit. Amandil of Andanig, whose lineage reached back to the very roots of the kingdom, Anne, Ryan and Isilda. Young men whose hearts burned with their grandfather's flame, and countless others whose names history would remember when the names of kings were lost in darkness. But they were no longer the voice of Nent Menna. That voice had been claimed by the king's men, who looked not west but east, not to Valinor but to Middle Earth, where their armies had begun to cast long shadows. These were men drunk on their own magnificence, intoxicated by the knowledge that their ships were the swiftest on all the seas, their swords the sharpest, their towers the tallest. Why should they bow to Valar, who hid behind veils of mist? Why should they accept limits when their power grew with each passing year? The transformation of Nent Menna became visible first in her harbors, where once ships had departed bearing aid to the free peoples of Middle Earth. Now black, sailed vessels carried legions hungry for tribute. The gentle influence that had once guided lesser kingdoms toward wisdom became an iron hand that demanded submission. Cities that had welcomed Nemta men, Rian traders with joy, now watched their horizons with fear. For the sea, kings had become sea conquerors, and their gifts had curdled into demands. In Armanellos, the very architecture began to reflect this change. The graceful curves of the early builders gave way to massive blocks of black stone, imported from quarries where the enslaved peoples of Middle Earth labored under the whip. Towers no longer rose to catch the morning light, but to dominate the skyline with their brooding presence. Gardens were paved over to make room for parade, grounds where armies drilled in formations, borrowed from the servants of darkness. And upon Meneltarma, the holy mountain where once only the king might set foot to offer prayers in the ancient silence, a new temple began to rise. Its stones were black as midnight, its altar hungry for sacrifices that would have horrified the early kings. The flame that had burned pure for centuries was extinguished, replaced by fires that gave no light but only smoke. Thick, choking clouds that veiled the stars and made the very air taste of ashes. The worship of Eru, the one who is above all thrones, gave way to darker devotions. In secret chambers beneath the new temples, priests offered libations to powers that had been chained in the void since the music began. The old prayers in Quenya were forgotten, replaced by words in tongues that hurt the throat to speak and made the listener's heart heavy with despair. Yet still the faithful kept their vigil. In hidden groves they planted seedlings of the white tree, teaching their children the true names of the stars and the stories of the undying lands. Their ships, smaller now and flying no banners, carried refugees from Middle Earth to safe harbors, bearing those who fled the growing tyranny of Nedmen, Reen ambition. At night, when the servants of the king's men slept, they would light fires on hilltops and sing the ancient songs, their voices carrying across the water like the cries of sea, birds seeking their lost homes. The sea itself seemed to sense the change. Storms came more frequently now, lashing the coasts with fury that spoke of divine displeasure. The great waves that had once caressed Numenor's shores with gentle fingers now struck like hammers, and the tide pools that had sparkled with life grew stagnant and foul. Even the gulls, those eternal companions of island dwellers, began to fly in strange patterns, as if the very air had become alien to them. In the royal library, where scribes had once recorded the deeds of heroes and the wisdom of sages, new books appeared bound in black leather and written in scripts that seemed to wreath upon the page. These were not histories but prophecies, not wisdom but seduction. Words that promised power without limit, dominion without end, life without the shadow of death. Young nobles devoured these texts with the hunger of starving men, and their eyes grew bright with a fever that no physician could cure. The division deepened with each passing season. Families split along lines invisible but absolute. Brothers who had shared the same cradle now looked upon each other as strangers. Wives turned from husbands whose words had grown cold and strange. Children learned to whisper lest their innocent questions reveal parents' dangerous loyalties. The very foundations of society, built upon trust and kinship, began to crack like walls in an earthquake, and in the deepest dungeons of Armanellos, where even the stones wept with damp despair, prisoners began to disappear. Not common criminals, for crime had been rare in the blessed Isle, but those whose only offense was to speak the old names with reverence, to teach their children the true history, to remember when Numenor had been a light to all the world, rather than a shadow falling across it. The faithful grew fewer, but their faith grew stronger. Pressed by persecution into the hidden corners of their own land, they became like diamonds compressed in the earth's depths, brilliant, hard, and unbreakable. Their prayers carried a new urgency, their songs a poignancy that made even the stones weep. They watched the sunset with longing that cut like knives, knowing that somewhere beyond the western darkness lay help that might never come, hope that might never be fulfilled. For in the palaces where kings had once walked in wisdom, new voices whispered of older powers, of alliances that transcended the boundaries between light and dark, of bargains that promised everything and delivered only corruption. The advisors who surrounded the throne no longer spoke of justice or mercy, but of expansion and domination, of taking what could be taken and holding what could be held. And then, from the east, came a shadow cloaked in fair form, the betrayer reborn. In the 31st century of Numenor's glory, when the island's power stretched like grasping fingers across all the coasts of Middle Earth, there came to the throne a king whose very name would become a byword for pride's ultimate folly. Pharazôn the Golden was tall beyond the measure of mortal men, fair as the morning star and mighty as the storm-driven sea. His voice could move hearts to tears or stir them to fury. His presence filled whatever hall contained him, and his ambition knew no bounds save those he refused to acknowledge. He had won his crown through strength of arms, wresting it from the rightful line in a display of power that left no room for doubt about his capabilities. The nobles who might have opposed him fell silent before his magnificence. The armies that might have resisted him knelt, instead in awed submission. And the people who should have mourned the breaking of ancient law found themselves instead drunk on dreams of conquest that their golden king whispered in their ears like wine. It was Pharazôn who first dared to name himself King of Men, not merely of Numenor, but of all the children of Iluvatar who drew breath beneath the stars. His fleets darkened every sea. His armies marched the length and breadth of Middle Earth, and tribute flowed into his treasure houses like rivers swollen with spring floods. Yet for all his earthly dominion, there remained one realm that defied him, one shadow that refused to bow before his golden splendor. In the land of Mordor, where the fires of Mount Doom painted the sky in shades of crimson and ash, there sat upon a throne of iron one who had walked with the Valar in the days before time began. Sauron the Deceiver, Gorthor the Cruel, the lieutenant of Morgoth, who had survived his master's fall to build an empire of his own from the bones of the defeated. Here was a rival whose power matched even that of the Golden King, whose malice ran deeper than the roots of mountains, and whose ancient wisdom had been twisted into forms that made strong men weep to contemplate. The war that followed shook Middle Earth from the grey heavens to the Sea of Ron. Armies clashed beneath skies lit by unnatural fires. The very earth cracked under the weight of their conflict. And the songs of that time speak of battles where the sun itself seemed to stand still in horror at what it was forced to illuminate. But for all Sauron's cunning and all the power of his Nazgul servants, he could not stand against the full might of Menna unleashed. When Pharazôn's forces broke through the Black Gate like a golden tide, when his banners flew from the very walls of Barad-dûr, when defeat stared him in the face like the spectre of his own mortality, Sauron did what he had always done. He adapted. If he could not conquer by strength, he would conquer by seduction. If he could not rule through fear, he would rule through desire. The messenger who approached the Golden King's pavilion came not in chains, but in robes of silver and gold. Not crawling, but walking with the measured dignity of one who comes to treat with equals. This was not the broken servant that Pharazôn had expected, but a being of such overwhelming presence that even the king's guards stepped backward without conscious thought. Sauron had chosen his form with the care of an artist selecting pigments for a masterpiece. Tall he stood, but not so tall as to dwarf the king he came to seduce. Fair he was, but with a beauty that spoke of wisdom and power rather than mere physical perfection. His voice, when he spoke, carried harmonies that recalled the music of creation itself, and his words fell like honey from lips that seemed incapable of falsehood. "Great king," he said, and even his submission sounded like a gift freely given rather than a defeat acknowledged. "I come not as one conquered, but as one who recognizes in you the heir to powers that should never have been denied to mortal men. Too long have the Valar kept their secrets. Too long have they hidden from you the knowledge that is your right to possess." The words worked their poison slowly, drop by drop, like wine laced with subtle drugs. Pharazôn, who had expected to triumph over a broken enemy, found himself, instead, drawn into conversations that stretched through the watches of the night. Debates about the nature of power, discussions of realms that lay beyond the circles of the world. Sauron spoke not of surrender, but of alliance, not of servitude, but of partnership in enterprises that would make the conquest of Middle-earth seem like a child's game. "You have shown," the deceiver murmured as they walked through gardens where captured treasures gleamed in the moonlight, "that the strength of men need bow to nothing, not to elf lords in their fading realms, not to dwarf kings in their mountain halls, not even to the Valar in their western paradise. Why then should you content yourself with ruling mud and stone when you might claim dominion over the very foundations of existence?" The journey back to Numenor became a triumph beyond the dreams of any previous king. Pharazân's ships bore home treasures beyond counting, slaves beyond numbering, and proof beyond questioning that Numenor's power had reached its absolute zenith. But the greatest treasure he carried was his prisoner, though which of them was truly captive would soon become terrifyingly clear. In the harbor of Arcamena, the crowds that had gathered to welcome their conquering king fell silent when they saw the figure who walked beside him, even in chains of gold, but chains nonetheless. Sauron commanded attention like a flame commands the gaze of moths. His beauty was unmarred by defeat, his dignity unbroken by captivity, and when he lifted his eyes to survey the white towers of Armanelos, many of those who watched felt a strange stirring in their hearts, as if something long sleeping had suddenly awakened. The months that followed became a masterclass in the art of corruption. Housed not in a dungeon, but in a palace, treated not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest, Sauron began the slow work of transforming victory into defeat, conquest into surrender. He spoke to the king of the unfairness of laws that granted immortality to some while denying it to others. He whispered of the cowardice of Valar, who hid behind barriers of mist and shadow, rather than face the righteous anger of men. He painted visions of Numenor restored to its proper place, not as a gift from the gods, but as the first conquest in a campaign that would storm the very gates of heaven. "Consider," he would say as they walked through halls where the king's advisors listened with growing fascination. "What the elves possess that you do not? Not greater courage? For who has shown more valor than the men of Westerness? Not greater wisdom? For what sage among them has built an empire to rival yours? No, they possess only one thing that you lack: the arrogance to claim what they believe is theirs by right." Night after night, the poison did its work. Pharazôn, who had conquered every enemy that dared face him in battle, found himself conquered by arguments that no sword could cut, by logic that no shield could turn aside. The Valar were revealed not as benevolent guardians, but as jealous tyrants hoarding power they had never earned. The prohibition against sailing west was exposed not as divine wisdom, but as fearful desperation. The mortality of men was shown to be not a gift, but a curse, not a blessing, but a cosmic injustice that demanded correction. In the temples of Numenor, new altars rose. The clean flames that had once honored Eru were extinguished, replaced by fires that gave more heat but less light, that demanded sacrifices of flesh and blood rather than offerings of bread and wine. The priests who had once taught of mercy and justice found their voices silenced, their places taken by new servants who spoke in tongues that made the stones themselves seem to weep. And in the highest tower of the palace, in a chamber that had once been reserved for prayer and contemplation, Pharazôn spent his evenings in conversation with his prisoner, learning truths that felt like revelations and hearing promises that sounded like prophecies. The chains that bound Sauron grew, lighter with each passing day, while invisible shackles settled around the king's heart, forged not of iron but of pride, ambition, and the terrible hunger for that which is forbidden. He spoke not of Morgoth's chains, but of his throne, not of death, but of dominion eternal. The transformation of Numenor accelerated. Ships that had once carried aid to the oppressed now bore instruments of oppression. Taxes flowed not to fund hospitals and schools, but to build temples where screams echoed through the night. The very air grew thick with smoke from sacrificial fires, and the stars themselves seemed to dim, as if reluctant to shine upon the horrors being committed in their light. Yet still some voices rose in protest. Amandal of Annneed dared speak against the growing madness, his words carrying the weight of ancient nobility and the pain of watching his beloved homeland slide toward the abyss. The faithful gathered in secret places, their prayers taking on the urgency of those who see disaster approaching and can do nothing to prevent it. In hidden chambers, they preserved the white saplings that would one day grow into symbols of hope. And in their hearts they nursed the flame of loyalty that no corruption could extinguish. But their voices were drowned in the chorus of acclaim that rose from the majority. For the first time in centuries, death itself seemed conquerable. For the first time since the founding of the kingdom, the boundaries that had limited Numenor, and ambition, seemed ready to fall. The people looked upon their golden king with adoration that bordered on worship. And when he spoke of sailing west to claim what was rightfully theirs, few were those who dared question the wisdom of challenging the gods themselves. The king of men would soon march upon the gods themselves. In the harbors of Numenor, where once the greatest vessels had been built for trade and exploration, there now rose from the shipyards a fleet that defied all previous understanding of naval might. The great armada of Pharazôn stretched beyond the horizon, a forest of masts and a sea of sails that blocked out the sun itself when they unfurled in the morning wind. Each ship was a masterwork of engineering and artistry, hulls black as midnight carved with golden figureheads that seemed to writhe with malevolent life, sails woven from silk that had been blessed or cursed in the new temples where sacrifice had replaced prayer. The construction had taken years, and every one of those years had seen Numenor transformed further from the paradise it had been into something that even its own children sometimes failed to recognize. Trees that had grown for millennia were felled to provide timber for the fleet, their ancient groves replaced by quarries where slaves labored to extract the stone for ever more temples to the giver of freedom. As Sauron was now named in the public squares, the very landscape bore scars like wounds that would not heal, testament to a people's determination to challenge the order of creation itself. From his palace in Armanelos, Pharazôn surveyed his preparations with satisfaction that bordered on intoxication. The reports that reached him spoke of a military force beyond anything the world had ever seen. Soldiers whose armor gleamed like captured starlight, weapons forged in fires hot enough to melt the foundations of mountains, provisions enough to sustain an army for decades of campaigning in lands beyond the edges of all maps. Never before had mortal hands assembled such might, and never again would they have need to. For this would be the final war, the conquest to end all conquests. Yet in the quiet corners of the island, among those whose loyalty remained fixed upon the western stars, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Elendil the Tall moved like a man walking through a waking nightmare, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what must come to pass. In secret chambers beneath his house in Andernede, he gathered the treasures of the faithful Palantir, ray that still showed true visions, swords blessed in the forges of Numenor's youth, and most precious of all, 7 seedlings of Nimloth the Fair, the white tree that had been cut down to feed the fires of the new temples. Amandil, his father, had grown gaunt with grief and sleepless nights spent in contemplation of the disaster approaching with the inexorability of the tide. The bloodline of the lords of Andernede reached back to the very founding of the kingdom, and through his veins flowed memories of wisdom that the current age had rejected. He alone among the great lords dared still to counsel the king against his intended course, and his words fell like drops of pure water upon stones heated in flame. They hissed and were gone, leaving no trace save the memory of their futility. "My lord and king," he had said in the last council, meeting where dissent was still tolerated, "consider what you propose. The Valar have been patient with us through all our transgressions, forgiving much that might have earned their wrath. But there are boundaries that cannot be crossed without consequences that will echo through all the ages of the world. The straight road was forbidden to us not from malice, but from mercy. We were not made to bear the weight of immortality." But his words were dismissed as the fearful mutterings one too old to understand the glorious destiny that awaited the king's new advisors. Their faces flushed with the fervor of converts to a cause that promised everything and demanded only the abandonment of conscience, spoke instead of the injustice of limitations placed upon those strong enough to break them. Why should the children of Eru bow to his servants? Why should the created accept boundaries drawn by their fellow creatures? The sea itself seemed to sense the approaching abomination. Waves that had caressed Numenor's shores for millennia grew restless and strange, their rhythm breaking into patterns that hurt the ear and made the heart race with nameless anxiety. Sailors reported currents flowing in directions that defied all known laws of tide and wind, while fishermen spoke of catches that tasted of salt and sorrow rather than the clean flavor of the deep waters. On Meneltarma, the holy mountain that had once been the heart of Numenor's spiritual life, the new priests conducted rituals that would have horrified their predecessors. Where once the king alone had been permitted to climb to the summit and offer prayers in the ancient silence, now crowds gathered to witness ceremonies that seemed to make the very stones bleed. The flame that burned there now gave off smoke so thick and black that it stained the clouds. And when the wind carried it across the island, children woke screaming from nightmares they could not remember. Yet, for all the corruption that surrounded him, Pharazôn remained magnificent in his terrible purpose. Standing upon the highest tower of his palace, his golden hair streaming in the wind, and his eyes fixed upon the western horizon with an intensity that seemed to burn, he was every inch the king he claimed to be. His voice, when he addressed the multitudes gathered to witness his departure, carried to every corner of the kingdom and beyond a sound like thunder given form and purpose. "Men of Numenor!" he cried, and the very air seemed to vibrate with his words. Too long have we accepted the chains that lesser beings sought to place upon us. Too long have we bowed to those who style themselves our betters, while cowering behind mists and shadows. The time has come to claim our rightful place in the order of creation, to take by strength what should have been ours by right, to show all the peoples of Arda that the children of Eru need. "Bow to none but Eru himself!" The cheers that answered him seemed to shake the foundations of the world. From every harbor, every city, every corner of the star-shaped island, voices rose in acclamation that drowned out the warnings of storm, winds, and the protests of those few who still remembered wisdom. The people of Numenor had made their choice, and they would follow their golden king into whatever doom awaited, glorying in their strength and blind to the price that such glory demanded. The faithful made their own preparations in the shadow of the greater madness. Ships smaller than the least vessel in the Great Armada were provisioned in secret, their holds filled not with weapons of war, but with seeds and saplings, scrolls and memories, all the gentle treasures of a civilization that was about to destroy itself in pursuit of an impossible dream. Children were taught the true names of the stars in whispers. Wives embraced husbands who might not return from the storm to come, and prayers were offered to the night wind in languages that the new order had declared forbidden. Isilda, young and fierce with the passion of one who sees clearly in an age of blindness, made his own desperate gesture of defiance. In the dead of night, while the guards of the temple of the Giver of Freedom lay drugged with wine, he stole into the sacred precinct, and there, where the white tree had been cut down to feed the altar fires, he retrieved a single fruit that had escaped the flames. It was hardly larger than a child's fist, its skin already withering. But within it lay the hope of renewal that no darkness could completely extinguish. The morning of departure dawned clear and bright, as if the very heavens were mocking the folly about to be committed beneath their vast expanse. The Great Armada stretched from the harbour of Arkamena to the very edge of sight, so vast that those who watched from the hills could see neither its beginning nor its end. Ships beyond counting, crews beyond numbering, and at their head the golden galleon that bore Pharazôn himself, its prow carved in the likeness of an eagle whose eyes seemed to burn with captured fire. The sea, which had grown increasingly restless in the days leading up to this moment, suddenly became mirror, still. Not the stillness of peace, but the terrible quiet that precedes the hurricane, when even the fish dive deep and the seabirds flee to whatever shelter they can find. The water looked like polished obsidian, reflecting not the sky above, but something darker. Something that made men avert their eyes and clutch whatever tokens of faith they still possessed. And when the king set sail into the west, the world itself trembled. The great armada moved across the strangely still waters with a majesty that was both magnificent and terrible. A sight to inspire awe in any heart capable of appreciating the achievements of mortal hands. The largest fleet ever assembled by the children of Ilúvatar spread across the western sea like a moving city. Its banners streaming in artificial winds that the new priests conjured with words learned in darker schools than any that had existed in Numenor's golden age. At the head of this impossible procession sailed Pharazôn himself, standing upon the deck of his flagship like a figure carved from living gold. The crown upon his brow caught and reflected light that seemed to come from within, rather than from the sun above, and his voice carried across the water with a power that made the very waves bow before it. Behind him stretched a line of vessels that defied the eye's ability to comprehend. Black, hulled giants whose bronze rams could shatter the gates of fortresses. Swift scouts whose crews scanned the horizon for any sign of the opposition they expected to meet. Supply ships groaning under the weight of provisions for a campaign that might last until the end of time itself. But no opposition came. The sea remained empty save for their own passage. And the sky above showed no sign of the winged messengers or celestial armies that might have been expected to challenge such an unprecedented act of defiance. The silence was complete, absolute, and somehow more terrifying than any show of force could have been. It was the silence of judgment suspended, of patience finally exhausted, of powers so vast that they had no need to threaten, because their very existence was threat enough. Days passed in this eerie calm, then weeks, then months. The armada sailed on across waters that never varied in their glassy perfection, beneath skies that showed no clouds, no storms, no variation whatsoever in their blank azure expanse. Time itself seemed suspended, as if the world held its breath in anticipation of something too vast for mortal understanding. Some of the soldiers began to mutter that they had sailed beyond the edge of the world into regions where natural law held no sway, while others whispered that they had been sailing in circles and would never find the destination they sought. But Pharazôn's will held them to their course. His navigators, guided by arts learned from Sauron himself, pointed always toward the west, toward the darkness that lay beyond the curve of the earth, toward the undying lands that had been forbidden to mortal feet since the music of creation first gave form to void. The king's certainty was absolute, his purpose unwavering, and his presence alone was enough to quell the doubts that might otherwise have turned his mighty fleet toward home. Then, on a morning that began, like all the others in that timeless voyage, the lookouts reported something that made even the bravest hearts falter. Ahead, rising from the waters like the first mountain ever made, was a sight that no mortal eyes had been meant to see: the coast of Ammon itself, the blessed realm, the undying lands where the Valar kept their eternal vigil. The shores gleamed with a light that was not quite sunlight. The towers that rose beyond the harbors were carved from substances that had no names in any mortal tongue. And the very air above that sacred land seemed to sing with harmonies that recalled the music from which all things came. Pharazôn's triumph was complete. He had done what no king before him had ever dared attempt. He had found and reached the realm of the gods themselves. His laughter rang across the water like a bell of victory, and his voice, raised in exultation, carried to every ship in his vast fleet. "Behold," he cried, his words echoing from bow to stern of the impossible armada. "The walls that were meant to keep us out. The shores that we were told would never know the tread of mortal feet. Yet here we stand, proven greater than those who sought to limit us, vindicated in our refusal to accept the boundaries that fear and envy sought to place upon us." The crews cheered until their voices gave out. The soldiers polished their armor until it blazed like captured stars. And the great engines of war were prepared for a conflict that would determine the very nature of existence. Never had mortal men stood upon the threshold of such absolute victory. Never had the children of Ilvatar come so close to claiming equality with those who had shaped the world itself. But in the depths of creation, in spaces that existed beyond the reach of time and matter, in halls where the Valar took counsel, in voices that could shatter mountains or whisper life into the smallest flower, a decision was made that would echo through all the ages yet to come. The rebellion of Nen Menna had passed beyond forgiveness. The pride of men had grown beyond correction, and the moment had arrived when patience must give way to justice, mercy to judgment, and long suffering to the terrible mathematics of consequence. Manog, Lord of the Winds and mightiest of the Valar, lifted his voice in a call that reached beyond the circles of the world, beyond the halls of Mandos, where the spirits of the dead waited for the end of all things, beyond even the timeless halls where Eru Ilvatar dwelt in majesty too great for any mind to compass. It was a call for intervention direct and absolute, for power that would brook no resistance, for an ending that would serve as beginning for all the ages yet to be born. The response came not as voice or vision, but as a change so fundamental that the very nature of existence shifted to accommodate it. Eru himself, the one who is above all thrones and beyond all dominions, turned his attention toward the small drama being played out upon the waters of his creation. And in that moment of divine regard, everything changed. The sea, which had been still as polished glass throughout the long voyage, suddenly began to move. Not with the familiar motion of waves driven by wind, but with the deep stirring of waters that had not known disturbance since the world was young. From the uttermost depths came a rumbling that made the largest ships seem like toys in a child's bath, a sound that was felt in the bones before it was heard by the ears. Then came the thunder, not the comfortable thunder of earthly storms, but the voice of creation itself, speaking words that no mortal throat could pronounce, syllables that rewrote the laws of physics with each rolling boom. The sky, which had been empty of clouds, suddenly filled with formations that defied description, shapes that seemed to be made of light and shadow intertwined, colors that had no names because they had never before shone in any earthly sky. The Armada, which had seemed so mighty when it departed from Nenta Menna's harbors, was revealed in an instant for what it had always been: a collection of wooden toys floating upon an ocean whose depths contained the power to unmake worlds. Ships that had been built to last for centuries cracked like eggshells. Masts that had been carved from the strongest trees splintered like twigs, and sails that had been woven with arts borrowed from the servants of darkness burst into flames that gave no heat but burned with cold that froze the very air. But it was not the destruction of the fleet that marked the true magnitude of what was occurring. Far beneath the surface of the sea, in places where the roots of mountains rested upon the foundations of the world itself, those foundations began to shift. The great tectonic plates that held continents in their places groaned with stress that would have shattered lesser worlds, and cracks appeared in the bedrock of reality itself. Numenor, the Blessed Isle, the star-shaped jewel that had been the crown of mortal achievement, began to sink. Not slowly, as earthly things sink when the sea claims them, but with the implacable certainty of divine judgment made manifest. The white towers of Armanelos tumbled into ruins. The golden halls where kings had held court filled with waters that boiled with unnatural heat. And the very streets where children had played became channels for torrents that carried away the accumulated treasures of 30 centuries. Upon Meneltama, the holy mountain where corrupt priests had offered abominable sacrifices, the flames of their altars were extinguished by waters that rose from the living rock itself. The temple built to honor the giver of freedom cracked from foundation to pinnacle, its black stones crying out as they fell into the abyss that opened beneath them. And somewhere in those final moments, as the mountain itself began to crumble, the voice of Sauron could be heard, not in triumph now, but in terror and fury, as he realized that his carefully laid plans had brought about not victory, but mutual destruction. The sea rose and rose, swallowing harbors and hills, cities and farms, until only the highest peaks remained above the churning waters. And even these were claimed in the end, pulled down into depths where no mortal craft would ever sail, where no earthly light would ever shine, where the greatness of Numenor would lie forever hidden beneath the weight of divine displeasure. The Armada, caught in waters that defied every law of nature, simply ceased to exist. Ships that had been built to weather any storm, crews that had conquered every nation they had encountered, weapons that had been forged to break the gates of heaven itself, all vanished in an instant, not destroyed but unmade, not sunk but removed from the very fabric of reality, as if they had never been. Ah, Pharazôn the Golden, who had dared to challenge the gods themselves, found himself and his entire army entombed in caves beneath the blessed realm, neither alive nor dead, but suspended in a twilight existence that would endure until the end of the world and the final judgment of all things. There they would wait, frozen in the moment of their greatest hubris, until the day when the earth would be remade and all accounts would be settled. And so ended the pride of men. The world bent, and the sea swallowed their glory. Yet from the ruin, a few ships still sailed east, carrying the last hope of Numenor. In the final hours before the world changed forever, while Pharazôn's mighty armada sailed toward its appointment with divine justice. 9 ships slipped quietly from the harbor of Arca, Menor under cover of darkness. These were not the black, hulled giants of the great fleet, not the bronze, rammed vessels of conquest, but smaller craft built for different purposes. Vessels meant to preserve rather than destroy, to carry hope rather than death, to sail not toward dominion, but toward survival. At their head sailed Elendil the Tall, whose name would echo through all the ages, yet to come as a byword for faithfulness in the face of overwhelming disaster. Behind him came his sons Isildur and Anrian, their own ships laden with the treasures of a dying civilization. Not gold or jewels. For what need would refugees have of such things, but seeds and saplings, scrolls and memories? The fragile inheritance of wisdom that must not be allowed to perish with the land that gave it birth. The leaving was like a knife twisted in the heart. These were men who had loved Numenor with a passion that transcended reason, who had walked her white, paved streets and sailed her crystal waters, who had breathed air perfumed with malorn blossoms and watched sunsets paint her towers in shades of gold and rose. To abandon her now, in her final darkness, felt like the betrayal of everything they held sacred. Yet to remain would have been the greater betrayal, for it would have meant allowing the flame of true kingship to be extinguished forever. In the hold of Elendil's ship, carefully tended in boxes of earth, blessed in the ancient manner, 7 saplings of the white tree waited in patient silence. These were the children of Nimloth the Fair, the mother, tree that had grown in the courts of Numenor's kings until the axes of corruption cut her down to feed the fires of false temples. Isildur had saved them at the cost of his own blood, stealing into the sacred precinct, while guards, drugged with wine, lay senseless at their posts, gathering up the hope of renewal in his scorched and burning hands. The Palantirai also sailed with them. The seeing stones that had been crafted in Valinor itself in the days when friendship existed between the elves and the men of the West. 7 stones there were, each one a perfect sphere of crystal that could show visions of things far distant in space or time, each one a link in a chain of communication that would one day span the breadth of Middle-earth. They lay wrapped in silk that had been woven in the looms of An Nig, protected by blessings that no darkness could penetrate, waiting for the day when they would once again serve the cause of the light. But the greatest treasure that sailed with the faithful was not one that could be held in mortal hands or stored in any earthly treasury. It was the memory of what Numenor had been in her glory, before pride corrupted her heart and fear twisted her purposes. In the minds of those who fled, there lived still the vision of white towers rising from green hills, of harbors where ships arrived bearing gifts rather than demands for tribute, of gardens where every flower bloomed in its proper season, and every tree grew exactly as it was meant to grow. The sea that bore them east was no longer the same sea that had caressed Numenor's shores in gentler times. Even before the final cataclysm struck, the waters had grown strange and hostile, filled with currents that ran against all natural law and tides that obeyed no moon's calling. The very air tasted of ash and endings, while the stars above seemed dimmed by smoke that rose from fires too distant to see but too near to ignore. Yet as they sailed through that night of terror, something began to change in the sky behind them. A light was growing there, but not the clean light of dawn or the gentle radiance of moon and stars. This was the harsh brilliance of judgment made manifest. The fire of divine wrath kindled at last to consume the corruption that had spread too far to be healed by any gentler means. The sound came first, a roaring that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the world, as if the sea itself had found voice and was crying out in pain or rage or prophetic fury. Then came the light, growing brighter and brighter, until it seemed that a second sun had risen in the west, illuminating the waves with colors that had no names in mortal speech. Behind them, invisible now beyond the curve of the world, but present in every heart like a wound that would never heal, Numenor was dying. The blessed isle that had been home to 30 centuries of mortal greatness was sinking beneath waters that boiled with supernatural heat, her towers falling, her gardens drowning, her people crying out in languages that the new order had taught them to prefer over the tongues their fathers had spoken. The ships of the faithful rode the chaos like leaves upon a hurricane, their hulls groaning under stresses that should have shattered them, their sails straining against winds that seemed to blow from every direction at once. Yet they held together, bound not by mortal craft alone, but by the strength of the oaths that had been sworn in their building, blessed by prayers offered in the ancient words that still held power over the elements. For 3 days and 3 nights, they sailed through waters that defied description, beneath skies that showed portents no human eye had ever witnessed. The sea itself seemed to be remaking itself around them, currents flowing in new patterns, depths opening where shallows had been, islands rising from places where only empty water had existed since the world began. The very geography of creation was being rewritten to accommodate the magnitude of what had been destroyed. When the 4th dawn finally broke, it revealed a world changed beyond recognition. The sea had calmed, but it was not the same sea they had known. The stars above were arranged in new patterns, constellations that would guide, navigators of future ages, but meant nothing to those who had learned their sailing by the lights of the elder days. Even the taste of the air was different, charged with possibilities that had not existed before the downfall, heavy with the weight of a future that must now be built from the ashes of the past. Ahead of them, growing larger with each league they sailed, stretched the coastlands of Middle-earth. Not the Middle Earth they had known and traded with, and occasionally conquered, but a realm made strange by the cataclysm that had reshaped the world. New mountains rose where valleys had been. New rivers flowed toward the sea through channels carved by unimaginable forces. And new forests grew from soil enriched by the tears of creation itself. It was here that the faithful would make their new home. Here that the white tree would take root in alien ground. Here that the kingship of Numenor would find its fulfillment in realms that would endure when the very memory of the blessed isle had faded into legend. Arnor and Gondor would rise from the sorrow of the survivors, built not on the pride that had destroyed their fathers, but on the humility that comes from witnessing the price of hubris. The ships made landfall on beaches of black sand that still glowed with heat from the fires that had raged through the night of the world's remaking. Behind them, the sea stretched empty to the western horizon, holding no trace of the island paradise that had vanished beneath its waves. Ahead lay the work of generations, the patient labor of building new cities, new kingdoms, new hopes from the fragments of a civilization that had chosen destruction over wisdom. But even in exile, the shadow followed, for Sauron's spirit had not drowned. In the libraries of later ages, when scholars gather around flickering candles to debate the meaning of ancient texts, they speak in hushed voices of the parallels that echo through the halls of memory. For the tale of Numenor's fall was not the first time that mortal pride had reached toward heaven, nor would it be the last. In the deepest archives of human consciousness, there lies a story that predates even the eldest of the Eldar. The memory of Atlantis. That first great civilization that sank beneath the waves when its people forgot the boundaries that separate the possible from the forbidden. Tolkien himself, the scholar sage who preserved these chronicles for generations yet unborn, admitted in letters that would outlive the kingdoms of his own age that Numenor was indeed his Atlantis. Not a copy, but a completion. Not a retelling, but a revelation of the eternal pattern that governs the rise and fall of all earthly powers. In the drowning of the Blessed Isle, he saw reflected the drowning of every civilization that has ever chosen pride over wisdom, domination over service, the satisfaction of desire over the acceptance of divine decree. The pattern is always the same, written into the very fabric of creation like a law of nature more fundamental than gravity or light. First comes the blessing, power granted to those who have proven themselves worthy, wisdom offered to those who have shown themselves capable of bearing it without corruption. In Atlantis, it was mastery over the elements themselves, technology that could move mountains and redirect rivers, knowledge that made its possessors seem like gods to lesser peoples. In Numenor, it was the gift of long life, the favor of the Valar, the blessing of dwelling in a paradise where every need was met and every desire fulfilled. But blessing, when received by hearts unprepared for its weight, becomes curse. The very gifts that were meant to elevate human nature begin instead to corrupt it, feeding ambitions that grow like cancers in the soul. The power to heal becomes the power to harm. The wisdom to guide becomes the cunning to manipulate. The strength to protect becomes the force to dominate. What was given in love is perverted by pride. What was offered in trust is twisted by fear. The second movement in this eternal symphony is always the same. The moment when gratitude dies and entitlement is born. The recipients of divine favor begin to see their blessings not as gifts, but as rights, not as responsibilities, but as privileges. The boundaries that were established for their protection become intolerable restrictions. The laws that preserved their happiness become chains that must be broken. In both Atlantis and Numenor, this corruption manifested in the same way. The forbidden realm to the west, the sanctuary of the gods that mortal feet were never meant to tread, became the focus of all their frustrated desire. Why should the blessed be denied the ultimate blessing? Why should those who had proven themselves superior to all other mortals still be considered inferior to the immortal powers? The questions are seductive in their logic, poisonous in their implications. They feed on the deepest weakness of the human heart, the inability to accept limitation, the refusal to acknowledge that there are roles for creatures and roles for creator, that the music of existence requires both instruments and composer. The third movement is always rebellion. Not the honest rebellion of the oppressed against their oppressors, but the darker revolt of the privileged against the very source of their privilege. In Atlantis, it took the form of weapons that could wound the gods themselves, technologies that sought to storm the citadels of heaven through purely material means. In Numenor, the rebellion was more subtle but no less complete. The corruption of worship itself, the transformation of temples into altars of sacrifice, the perversion of the relationship between mortal and divine from love to domination. And always, inevitably, comes the fourth movement, the cataclysm. For creation itself will not long endure the presence of powers that seek to unmake the very foundations upon which it rests. The flood comes, whether of water or fire or simple cessation of the divine favor that had kept chaos at bay. The proud towers fall. The mighty fleets are scattered. The accumulated wisdom of centuries vanishes beneath waves that remember everything and forgive nothing. Yet in both tales, in the echo that links Atlantis to Numenor, and both to every civilization that has ever reached too high, there is preserved a fifth movement, the survival of the faithful. Not the preservation of the civilization itself, for that was beyond redemption, but the rescue of its essence by those few who had remained true to the original vision. Seeds are saved from the garden before the fire consumes it. Children are carried to safety before the flood rises. Memories are preserved in minds that refuse to let wisdom die completely. This is the deepest truth embedded in the pattern, that divine justice, however terrible in its application, is never an ending but always a beginning. The destruction of the corrupt makes possible the birth of the pure. The drowning of the proud creates space for the humble to grow. The silencing of those who had forgotten how to listen allows new voices to speak words of healing rather than words of domination. In the libraries where scholars debate these matters, there is recognition that the tale of Numenor speaks not only to the past, but to every present moment when human beings stand at the crossroads between gratitude and entitlement, between service and domination, between accepting their place in the great design and seeking to remake that design according to their own desires. The pattern is eternal because the choice is eternal, written into the very nature of creatures possessed of both power and free will. The sea forgets no sin. It merely waits. In the turning of the great wheel that governs all the affairs of Middle-earth, the drowning of Numenor was not an ending, but a transformation. The changing of one form of evil into another, the migration of corruption from a dying host to find new flesh in which to grow and flourish. For Sauron, the great architect of the island's downfall, had not intended to perish with his victims. His spirit, freed from the beautiful form that had seduced Pharazôn, fled eastward across the sundering waters to find refuge in the one realm where his power still held dominion, the Black Land of Mordor, where Mount Doom burned with fires older than the sun. But transformation comes with cost, even for beings whose existence transcends the boundaries of mortal flesh. The fair form that had been Sauron's greatest weapon in the corruption of Numenor was lost forever, burned away in the cataclysm he had helped to unleash. Never again would he appear as the wise counselor, the beautiful advisor whose words fell like honey from lips that seemed incapable of falsehood. The deceiver was revealed at last in his true nature, shadow and flame, malice given shape, the very incarnation of the will to dominate and destroy. Yet even in this diminished state, his influence continued to spread like poison in a well. The refugees from Numenor who had fled to Middle-earth carried within their hearts not only the trauma of their great loss, but also the seeds of the corruption that had destroyed their homeland. They were not the proud king's men who had worshipped power above all else. But even the faithful bore scars that would take generations to heal. They had seen what happened when the boundaries between mortal and divine were challenged, when the gifts of the gods were mistaken for rights to be demanded, rather than graces to be received. In the kingdoms that rose from the ashes of exile, Arna in the north and Gondor in the south, this shadow manifested in subtle ways. The high culture of Numenor was preserved, its arts and sciences maintained, its traditions of kingship carefully guarded. But there was always an undercurrent of loss, a sense that what they had built in Middle Earth was but a pale reflection of what had been lost beneath the waves. The white tree bloomed in the courts of Minas Anor, but its flowers seemed smaller, its light dimmer than those that had graced the gardens of Armenelos. More dangerously, there persisted in the hearts of some an unspoken resentment against the fate that had been imposed upon their fathers. Why had the faithful been punished along with the guilty? Why had those who had remained true to the ancient ways been forced to share in the catastrophe that befell those who had embraced corruption? The questions were never asked aloud, but they festered in silence, creating cracks in the foundation of faith that future enemies would learn to exploit. It was into this wounded world that Sauron released his masterwork of deception, the rings of power. Not the crude corruption he had practiced in Numenor, where truth was simply inverted and good called evil, but something far more subtle and dangerous. The rings offered what seemed to be legitimate power, the ability to preserve and protect, to heal and to help. Who could object to the desire to keep beautiful things from fading, to maintain order against the encroaching chaos, to use wisdom and strength in service of noble purposes? The parallel to Numenor's original gifts was exact and deliberate. Just as the Blessed Isle had been granted long life and great wisdom as a reward for faithfulness, so the rings offered their bearers the power to extend their influence across time and space in service of worthy goals. Just as the sea, kings had been blessed with dominion over the waves in order to help the free peoples of Middle Earth, so the rings granted their wielders authority that could be used to bring peace and prosperity to troubled lands. The seduction worked precisely because it echoed the legitimate pattern of divine blessing. The difference lay not in the nature of the gifts, but in their source. Where Numenor's power had flowed from Eru, Ilvatar through the mediation of the Valar, the rings drew their strength from Sauron himself. And with that strength came an inevitable corruption that would manifest only when it was too late to resist. In Lindon, where Galad ruled the remnant of the Noldor with wisdom learned through long ages of sorrow, the rings were received with appropriate caution. The elven kings remembered Numenor's fall, remembered the price of reaching too far beyond appointed boundaries. They took the rings but used them sparingly, always mindful of the dangers inherent in power that seemed too good to be true. But in Gondor and Arna, where the descendants of the faithful ruled kingdoms built upon the foundation of their exile, the temptation was greater. These were men who carried in their blood the memory of a paradise lost, who ruled realms that seemed perpetually diminished compared to the glory their fathers had known. When rings were offered that could extend their lives, expand their influence, enable them to build something that might approach the majesty of sunken Numenor? How could they refuse? The corruption was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The kings of Gondor became more magnificent, their cities more beautiful, their influence more widespread. The northern kingdom of Arna extended its borders and deepened its wisdom, becoming a beacon of learning and justice in a world that seemed perpetually shadowed by ancient evils. All seemed well, better than well, and that was precisely the trap. For Sauron had learned from his experience in Numenor. This time he would not reveal himself too quickly, would not risk the direct confrontation that had ultimately led to his defeat. Instead, he would work through the rings themselves, slowly bending their wielders to his will, not through open corruption, but through the gradual inflation of their natural pride and ambition. They would fall not because they chose evil, but because they chose themselves. Not because they rejected good, but because they redefined it to serve their own purposes. The pattern of Numenor played out again in slower motion across the centuries of the Third Age. Gondor's glory reached its peak under the ship kings, who sent their fleets to every corner of the known world, bringing back wealth and tribute that made Osgiliath rival even the memory of Armanelos. But with the wealth came pride. With the pride came corruption, and with the corruption came the inevitable decline that followed as surely as autumn follows summer. The end, when it came, was not the dramatic cataclysm that had claimed Numenor, but something slower and more insidious. The failure of the royal line, the division of the kingdom, the long decay that left Gondor a shadow of its former self by the time the War of the Ring brought the Third Age to its close. Yet even then, in the darkest hour, when it seemed that all hope was lost, the pattern of salvation repeated itself. The faithful remnant preserved, the true king returned. The white tree blooming again in recognition that justice and mercy could still triumph over pride and corruption. And somewhere, beneath the deepest wave, the towers of Numenor still gleam, waiting for the day the sea gives up its dead. The waves that break upon the shores of Middle-earth in these latter days carry, within their endless rhythm, memories older than the kingdoms of men, deeper than the halls of the dwarf lords, more enduring than the songs of the elder, who fade now into the twilight of their long guardianship. Each tide that rises and falls speaks in a language that predates speech itself, telling stories to those with ears to hear of glories drowned and pride humbled, of towers that reached toward heaven and the justice that brought them low. In the deep places of the sea, where no living thing can venture and no earthly light can penetrate, there lie still the ruins of the greatest kingdom that mortal hands ever built. The white stones of Armanelos rest now in darkness absolute, but they have not crumbled as earthly stones should crumble. The weight of divine judgment that pressed them beneath the waves has also preserved them, held them in a timeless stasis where neither decay nor change can touch what remains of Numenor's glory. Sometimes, when the tide turns at that moment between day and night, when the world holds its breath in wonder, sailors speak of visions that rise from the depths like dreams made manifest. Towers of pearl and ivory gleam for an instant in the fading light. Gardens where flowers of living crystal bloom in colors that have no names. Harbors where ships of silver and gold lie at anchor, as if waiting for crews that will never come to claim them. But when they blink or turn to call their companions to witness, the visions fade like mist before the morning sun, leaving only the endless whisper of waters that might be laughter or might be weeping. The sea remembers everything because the sea is patient beyond the understanding of those who measure time in heartbeats and seasons. It remembers the first ships that ventured forth from Numenor's harbors, their sails white as sea, foam, and their crews singing songs of wonder at the world spread before them like an unread book. It remembers the gradual darkening of those sails, the changing of the songs from joy to hunger, the transformation of gifts into demands and aid into conquest. Most clearly of all, it remembers the final fleet, that impossible armada that stretched beyond the horizon, black, hulled, and bronze, rammed, carrying the pride of a people who had forgotten the difference between confidence and hubris. The sea remembers how those ships moved across its surface like a shadow of death, how the very waters recoiled from their passage, how the fish fled to the deepest trenches and the sea. Birds sought shelter in whatever caves they could find. But the sea also remembers what came after. The moment when the world broke and remade itself, when the straight paths were bent and the flat earth became round, when the western shores that had been forbidden became unreachable by any craft save those blessed by powers that dwelt beyond the circles of time. In that moment of cosmic transformation, the sea became the guardian of Numenor's memory, the keeper of her secrets, the final witness to what she had been and what she had become. In the ports of Pelagia and Dol Amroth, where the descendants of the faithful still maintain their watch against the shadows of the world, there are those who claim they can read the sea's moods as their fathers read the wind and weather. They speak of tides that run deeper than any earthly moon could pull, of currents that flow not from north to south or east to west, but from past to future, carrying with them fragments of days that are gone, but not forgotten. These mariners, whose blood remembers the blessing and the curse of westerness, sometimes find upon their beaches treasures that no earthly craft could have carried there, a sword whose blade bears the tree and 7 stars of the ancient kingdom. Though its steel should have rusted to nothing in the salt waters, a crown of mithril and gold that bears the likeness of kings whose names are recorded in no surviving chronicle, scrolls wrapped in silk that has not rotted despite centuries beneath the waves, bearing writing in scripts that predate the fall of Gil-galad and the ending of the Second Age. Yet for all these signs and wonders, for all the hints that something of Numenor endures beneath the waters that claimed her, the greater truth remains. The kingdom that was is gone forever, and no power in Middle Earth or beyond it can call back what the sea has taken to itself. The white tree blooms again in Minas Tirith, but it is not the same tree that grew in the courts of Numenor. The crown of Gondor rests upon the brow of Alessa the Elfstone, but it is not the same crown that Pharazôn wore when he sailed west to challenge the gods themselves. This is the hardest lesson that the sea teaches in its endless patience, that some endings are final, some losses cannot be recovered. Some choices once made cannot be unmade. The people of Numenor chose pride over humility, chose to grasp for what was forbidden, rather than treasure what was freely given, chose to make themselves gods, rather than remain faithful servants of the one who is above all thrones. The consequence of that choice was absolute and irrevocable. The drowning of their land, the scattering of their people, the ending of an age that would never come again. Yet even in its sternest moods, the sea speaks also of mercy, for mercy was shown to those who remained faithful. Mercy was granted to those who chose exile over corruption. Mercy was woven into the very pattern of the ending that seemed at first to know only justice. The ships of Elendil carried more than refugees from a sinking island. They carried the seed of renewal, the hope of rebuilding, the possibility that what had been lost in one form might be recovered in another. In the breaking of Numenor, the world itself was remade, not just in its physical structure, but in its spiritual dimensions. The straight road to Valinor was lost to mortal ships, but the road remained for those whose need was great enough and whose hearts were pure enough to walk it. The easy immortality that had been denied to the king's men was replaced by something harder but truer. The immortality of deeds done in service of the light, of words spoken in defense of truth, of lives given freely so that others might live in peace. The sea remembers all of this, holds it all within its depths like a vast archive written in currents and tides. And on those rare nights when the stars shine clear and the wind is still, when the boundary between sea and sky becomes uncertain, and the horizon speaks of distances beyond mortal reckoning, those who listen carefully can hear it. The sound of a kingdom singing beneath the waves, not in mourning for what is lost, but in eternal testimony to what remains. For even now, when the tide turns at dusk, the sea sighs in a language long forgotten, the song of a kingdom that would not bow, and somewhere, beneath the deepest wave, the towers of Numenor still gleam, waiting for the day the sea gives up its dead. In the silence that follows the telling of this tale, we hear the eternal rhythm of waves upon distant shores, carrying forward the memory of glory and downfall, of blessing received and blessing rejected, of the price that pride demands and the mercy that faithfulness finds. The story of Numenor is ended, but the story it tells, of mortal hearts torn between gratitude and ambition, between service and dominion, between accepting their place in the great design and seeking to remake that design according to their own desires. That story continues in every age, in every heart, in every moment, when the children of Ilvitar stand at the crossroads between paradise preserved and paradise lost. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.